Hi everyone, welcome to the 28th part of our masterclasses and the second one in this series. What we've been discussing last week was non-photorealistic rendering, and this week we're going to continue some of the bare bones and structural work that we need in order to actually build what we're looking for. So last week we went over the basics of our shaders, and I'm just going to show the outputs of last week. As you may or may not recall if you watched it, we have been trying to build line art styled environments. So particularly things like this image here, where we've got soft colors, simple line art, and we're going to render this in 3D. Now, one of the key things we did last week was getting a consistent sized line rendering, and we did that by manipulating the shader. So if you see, the white cube has no custom shader attached to it, the green cube does. And as we move closer, we'll notice the lines get thinner, they remain constant size, and as we get further apart, the lines again remain constant size. So the combination of these, this shader means that we can produce something that actually looks a bit closer to hand-drawn, particularly when we build the more complex scenes. The other thing we've done with our shader is we've made it use a screen space gradient. We may change that to a world space gradient, depending on how it looks, but we won't get to that just yet. But as you can see, if we change the colors on here, the overall color of the cube will depend on where on the screen it actually is being rendered. And this is just good for that sort of comic-y effect. Particularly artists like Mobius use a very similar technique in a lot of what they build. The other thing we did relatedly though is we actually added that support onto the lines themselves too. So what we can build is we can build very soft lines here that still match the outline. So if we're going to make this yellow, make that a little bit orangey, so we've got sort of some consistency there, and we'll just make this one also a little bit orange and a little bit yellow. And as you can see, we've got sort of very simple lines here. I believe we can actually also control the line width. One of these, we've got forget exactly which one. We might just go clean up the shader as well at some point. Nonetheless, that is where we got up to last week. Now, where we are going to be moving to this week is going on to some lighting and shadowing. Now, this gets things a little bit complicated because now we need to go deep into how Unity's rendering works. Shadowing is actually not the presence of an item blocking the light sources, it's the absence of light. And that means that by default, everything is in shadow except when it's lit. Now that makes life a little bit complicated if we're going to try and switch between, for instance, colors based on if something is in light or in shadow, because as far as the system's concerned, there's no concept of shadow. It's just simply the amount of light that's hitting the surface. So what we're going to do is we're going to build a custom lighting model for this. And there's a few ways we can go about how we do this. I've been debating two methods in my head, and I haven't tried neither method yet. So we're going to test that out and see how it behaves, because what I'd like to do is be able to use this second set of gradients that we've added to the background here to produce custom lighting effects, so that when the item is occluded by a shadowing surface, we get a different gradient than we do if it's above it. Now, there's two approaches, as I said, that we can go down this route. The first is using what's called a final color modifier. Now, the final color modifier is basically a quick shader function that runs after everything else has finished running. And that shader function basically just does something to the pixel. So what we could do is we could do, if the pixel is darker than a particular color, then multiply it by, for instance, the darker gradient. That's the first approach. And I have a feeling that approach is not going to work particularly well if we try and link this back into PBR rendering. So PBR is physically based rendering. And I'd like to do that because that means we can get things like metallic surfaces and reflective surfaces and things like that behaving in a consistent way inside this lighting model. That's going to be complex, but we will get to it. The alternative model that we can go, the alternative is that we rebuild this, rebuild a PBR pipeline that uses the gradients as part of its inputs. And there's a couple of ways we can go down that path. It depends on how much influence we want to have and whether we want to actually have the multiple gradients. My answer is probably yes. What we could do is a very simple approach. I'm just going to pull the shader up and give Visual Studio 2 or 3 minutes to boot up. A fantastic program, not very quick. Okay. All right, so we've got our shader here. Incidentally, if you have the Unity plugins for Visual Studio installed, you will get nice shader highlighting and a few other bits and pieces inside here. So last week what we did is we attempted to do a lighting ramp as a custom lighting model as a way of getting a start point on here. Now my preference is that we don't go down this route. I think that it's the wrong approach, and we will want to go with a full PBR model. Rather than going with the final color solution I mentioned first. And the reason for that is that I think that it'll give the best overall solution, even though it's going to be substantially more complicated. But there is some shortcuts we can take. So if I just take that, set that to standard, and I think that's standard surface output, or is it surface standard output? I think it's standard surface output. Let me just have a quick look. I do have the Unity docs open here because we've been flipping through a few of them today. And I've even got some other stuff open that will be useful to go down. I'm just going to quickly go to the surface functions though we need. Some lighting examples. I'm just trying to get the custom lighting models. One of these will give me the name of the thing that I've changed. Pardon me. Okay. It's surface output standard, I think. The standard surface output. We'll have to forgive me 1 sec. There we go, surface out standard, that's the one we want. Apologize for that. So we've got that in there. And that's basically just indicating what outputs we're going to provide off this. So we're also going to, we'll provide the metallic and smoothness here. Okay, now this is having no effect on the model, and the reason that's having no effect on the model is because we're using the emissive output. Now, when you do a surface shader, you've got these collections of outputs that you can put out to. So you've got the albedo, that's the sort of the base color if it was using a realistic lighting model. We've used emission, and emission is basically treating as this if it's a light source, in which case it can never get dimmed below that brightness. But we will want to. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to change this around. And let's find it. Sorry, this is the wrong code file I've got open now. Right. So I'm just going to change this to albedo instead of emissive. And as a result of that, this should now be complying with the lighting model as you expect it to. It'll get quite a bit darker as a result as well. And we're going to try and fix that back up. So yes, as you can see, it's now darker, and it is also receiving light out of the scene. But it also means that things can shadow it as well. Oh, that one won't because it's an unlit texture. We'll just grab a new basic cube. Certain shaders won't cast shadows, but as you can see here, we do now have shadows being casted. Now, because it's got that screen space effect and it's got part of the lighting, it doesn't look particularly great. So what we're going to do is we're going to try and spend today cleaning this lighting model up and getting it looking similar to how it did before, but with the added bonus that we've got some degree of control over things like the metallicness and smoothness. Like as you can see here, there is some PBR effects in place. And to really see those PBR effects, we're going to do 2 things. First is I'm going to bring in a more complex looking object. I'm going to build a capsule. And that's just because we've got a few rounded things on top of here. I'm just going to grab that panels material and drop it onto the capsule too. This way we can sort of start actually testing our PBR surfaces. So this is now a metallic object that's relatively smooth. One of the things you will notice when you do testing of PBR materials is you do want to pay attention to the actual environment it's in. Not having things like reflection probes will mean that your shaders won't preview as accurately as they can. So one of the quick things to do is just do a game object light reflection probe. I'm just going to drop it in the middle of the scene. I'm going to give it a quite big space. Yeah, there we go. That'll do. And I'll just bake this reflection probe in very quickly. Oh, it's going to bake the whole lighting model, isn't it? Yes, we're going to untick those guys. And just give it a second. Okay, there we go. Now we've got more accurate reflections for the scene. As you can see, it got quite a bit brighter. The problem is that this is still not going to match what we want, the look we're looking for. So it's going to be a sort of a hybrid between these models. And I think the easiest way to do this is to multiply the two effects together. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off with an albedo that acts like an emission, and then we're going to multiply in all the PBR effects on top of it. So to do that, what I've done here is I've downloaded the Unity sources, and I've done that off the Unity website. You can go to the download archive and you just find the Unity version that you're using. Doesn't really matter specifically which versions you're using, but I usually grab the version that whatever we're touching. So we're using 2.3 at the moment, 2017.2.3. So we'll just download the built-in shaders, and that'll give you a zip file full of things you can download that have got all the instructions on how the actual standard shader and things that Unity are built. And we can cut and paste those into our own shaders, which is exactly what we're going to do. The second thing we're going to do is we're not going to rebuild the entire lighting model from scratch. If we do that, we will be here all day and we won't produce anything good. So one of the quick tricks we can do, and I did this for an isotropic hair shader I built a while ago. This is on GitHub, by the way, so if you're doing hair, feel free to take a poke at this. As you can see, it's got a slightly different lighting model that it produces these bands. And that's sort of equivalent to what hair does, because there's lots of individual fibers rather than one solid surface, and as a result you get the banding happening kind of like that. It's called an isotropic highlight. But as a process of building that shader, one of the things I learnt was that you could actually inherit from the Unity lighting models and then override them, which is exactly what's in this file here. It's got a custom, what's called a BRDF lighting model in it. That is just some quick replacements off the Unity built-in one. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut and paste this file. In fact, no, actually I will cut and paste this file, but I'm just going to make some tweaks to it. And to do that, we're just going to create a big chunk at the top of our shader. In fact, what I may do is I may just make a CG Ink file so we can include it, rather than having this all in one monster. Maybe I'll just include it. Now this does probably rely on additional variables and things that don't exist in this lighting model, so I'm just going to quickly save it and just see if it does or not, because that will make some fun if it doesn't. I think that does look like it's got quite a few, in fact. So we'll undo a few of those, but I just want to make sure this works. Yes, there is, in fact. Errors all over the place. Let's have a look at what they are. Line 111. And already I'm suspicious. Okay, I'm just going to take out the custom BRDF because we probably aren't going to need that. We probably aren't. I'm just going to replace it with the Unity built-in BRDF instead. So where we've got this custom function, we're going to go into Unity sources. I've just pulled up the file name Unity standard BRDF and got the function names, and there's one called BRDF2, which is basically what that one had been cut and pasted from. So let's paste that into there, and I think it's used again there. We may also need to do some includes on the Unity standard stuff, but hopefully that's in there automatically. Fingers crossed. Okay, 38 is our problem child now. 38. Right, we're missing the declaration of that one. So I'll just do surface output standard, because we're not using any isotropic extra values here. good start. I just want to get this to a compiling state just before we get too deep into this. Okay, no declaration, we need to try 151.83. Desktop world vectors, let's just have a look at that one. So there's the Muda. Feeling that it just gets replaced. Normal italics. Just 1 second. I'm just going to keep digging through this. I may have got the wrong one. Unity BRDF function. I may have got the wrong functions. I might just need to go quickly digging through these sources and we'll just try and find the right ones, because that doesn't look like it. The reason I'm doing there is that the function we're using is also passing a metallic value, and I think if we don't include that metallic value, the whole thing's going to fall apart. Or at least if we want to maintain support for metallics. I swear that feels like that should be in there, but okay. Aha! The standard for BRDF. Where is this all put in? Okay, there we go. I think this is what we're looking for, in fact. So I'm just going to quickly duck back into here. Yes, okay, so we don't need the metallic at all. So I can just go. Just take that. I think that should do the job. So double check this works now. Just thinking a bit more, so hopefully that's a good sign. Okay, where are we going now? 67. Which function should exist? Okay, what I might do is I might just cut and paste from here instead, because this looks like a bit of a safer approach. So I'm just going to take that out, box in. We will just need to rename a few of these things because they're going to overwrite the built-in Unity one. So I'm just going to change that lighting standard from standard, we'll call it standard comic. Lighting standard comic, and with some luck, that should compile. Okay, yes, good. All right, so we've got our very basics here. I'm just going to switch this from using standard to using standard comic. And as you'll see here, that should look the same. Or not. 938 is up. We might need to declare our own surface model as well. say that, but that's how these things go. Okay. Now, where is this BRDF being declared? Now, what we're doing by doing this is that we're just getting ourselves back to a known state we can work from. Yay! Okay, fantastic. So now we have got our fully custom lighting model that looks exactly the same as the Unity built-in one, but this means we can now poke. And when we poke at things, we can do things like this. Using our own BRDF passes here, I'm just going to see what we'll do. So we might just we'll be using the deferred path, so I just might change that times 2. We've just done that as a very, very quick change in order to produce some results. Not quite working for that. That might be because it's not using the deferred pipe here. Let's just try this one. Using one of these. There you go. Okay, so we now know that it's using the forward-dependent rendering path. Now, when you build shaders that have got custom lighting models, you need to account for two lighting paths, forward and deferred. If you only build one, make sure the one you only build is forward, because mobile devices, WebGL, and older computers, we don't tend to use deferred rendering on, because the overall expense of deferred rendering is a bit too high. However, forward will run in it both environments, both deferred and forward environments will support both. Okay, so we've got our very basics there. We've just doubled the brightness. Now we need to think about how we're actually going to handle this. Now, what I'm hoping for is that we can get out of this BDRF functions the indirect and the direct. So gi.light, I have a feeling, just look up Unity GI class. See, there we go, struct Unity GI. Just Googling these various terms, we usually bring up what we want. Okay, so what's Unity light? Color, direction, and I think it's just the dot product is n.l. I think that might be the overall brightness, but we'll find out. We might play with the, actually it probably is the brightness combination of the light and the color. We'll find out. Okay. So we're going to start by changing the albedo. And the albedo we're going to set. We're going to start bringing in some extra colors in here too. So I'm just going to put in. We've now got our own custom output class for the surface shaders here, and I'm just going to bring in a fixed 3, and we're going to actually strip out albedo entirely. We're going to call it gradient 1, of gradient 1 and 2. In fact, yes, that's going to be our background gradient. Okay. So actually I might just put this as, rename this. It's not going to be gradient 1, and this is going to just be, that's just going to be background. And the background is going to be visible when we're in darkness. So I've just got albedo there. I'll just put odor background. And I set this to our screen background one. So we've got background 2 and 3, which maps to the unlit top and bottom. We've got the lit top and bottom. So I'm just going to set that to same function as that one there, but it's just going to be the 3 and 4, which we built before. I think that was what they're called. We can always check those at the very top of the shader. It'll give us the list here. So I'm going to put this, rename these around. I'm going to make this bright. I'm going to make this dark. Okay, so now I've got this background variable. We can start using it. So what we're going to do is I'm going to set this one to gi.light.color. I'm just going to do red here. We will actually use all of them, but I just want to test this one. Greater than 0.5. We're going to use the albedo, else we use the background. Okay, so we now have these ones. I'm just going to make these very distinctive colors. So we've got red and pink and blue. And immediately, here we go. As we put the shadow around, see what's happened. We've actually, that worked better than I thought for the first go. As you can see, that when it gets into darkness, i.e. it gets shadowed, the underlying color is changing. And we're now getting a purple or a blue instead. Now, it's not quite right because we seem to be inheriting, it's not perfect. Yes, the underlying albedo is still in use here, so we just might need to mess with this a little bit. So I'm going to put this as the albedo. I'm going to replace all these references to the albedo with this new one that's got a variable input. Okay, there we go. So now we've got so the basics going on here. So we've got a foreground and a background gradient. And this should, if we're lucky, do exactly what we were hoping for. Yep, so we've now got 2 gradients, and it's based on the overall lighting of the environment. So if I create a new point light in the scene, I'll make it cast shadows. Just need to try and get it so it's actually going to cast off. I'm going to hide you. You're not very helpful. There might be secondary passes going on for point lights. We might have to just test with that one. I think this is going to work with directional lights here, but not with those other lighting types. Okay, so we'll experiment with that one and just try and fix that in a moment. But first things first is that we've got the very basics of what we're trying to do down. Other thing we've got is that the lines are not the same. And we're going to make an extra set of colors here just for this one. So we're going to go with 8 colors in total. So I'm going to do line 1, line 2, and I'm just going to add 3 and 4 as well. Whoops, my font size seems to have been reset. Right, so we've got line top and bottom. We're just going to make this bright. Okay, and where we've declared our line 1 and line 2, we're just going to declare 3 and 4. Finally, just down here, we're going to do the same interactions we do on the foreground. So actually, just change this into 2 separate loops. So we've got the color back, color line. We'll do fixed for dark back. That one, and fixed for dark line. It's here. Now we're doing a whole bunch of stuff with extra lines, but it doesn't really matter because the overall calculation is the same. Now we're just changing it from color back. Oops. U and U. And that should mean we now get the lines into our shadowed area as well. Hooray! Now, I think I might have set the wrong numbers on that one. Yes, 3 and 4. Great, so now we've got something that does something, but that should be a good starting point. Now, there's a couple of things that I don't like about the shader. Although it's not bad, there is a bit of a hard cutoff. In fact, I don't know if I want to keep that or not between light and dark, because a lot of what we're going to do is going to be doing subtle effects. I've got a fairly distinct gradient there, but what if we change this around so that we're going for very sort of neutral colors? Let's go for I'm just going to set these ones to the same. I'm just going to lower them down by a bit, not by much, just a little bit. And okay, let's drop these guys a little bit further. In fact, I may have even gone a bit too strong on those line colors. We're really going to go for subtle here, but sort of how we're going to go. Okay, so what's interesting is that the lower the smoothness, I'm not sure it's having as much effect on the overall design. What I'm probably going to want to do is override some of how the shading works too. Though having high metallic does seem to give us a bit more of a desired look. It still feels a little bit realistic here, and I think part of that's just because of the fact that our shadows aren't quite so harsh as they probably should be. So I'm probably going to just poke into the lighting model here and see if I can just make it a bit softer on its approach. Okay, so what do we do here? The real magic is happening here in this Unity BRDF PBS function, which, as we can see from here, is just linking into a whole bunch of different functions, which finally are implemented actually here. Sorry, here. And I think the root of it is coming down to the Fresnel and grazing terms, which might have some impact, although that's going to be more for the metallics. Let's see, BDF Direct 3. So what I'm going to do is we're going to take this a whole another several levels in. We're going to start fixing our own BDRF functions, and we're just going to mess with those too. So again, we've just cut and pasted this section into the lighting model. This shader is getting bigger and bigger, and we will probably start breaking it out into multiple files in a moment. The reason I don't like doing that by default is that Unity's shader recompiler doesn't always detect files in changes in shaders that aren't changes in shaders that are made in a subfile. It won't always recompile the parent that's calling it. Okay, so we've got our BRDF3 functions here, so I'm just going to find the one we want, which is our direct. It should be in here somewhere. And I will actually post the source files for this shader once we're done with it, because I can imagine that it's going to be useful just to be able to poke around at these rather than having to work out how to build them completely from scratch every time you want to work with it. So I just need to find that lighting function I was looking at. There we go. That's what we're looking for. I'm just going to make sure this function does in fact work. I'm just going to do that by injecting some garbage into it, just so we can see that there's an impact. I'm not sure if that changed. That would be a no. Okay. So we know that that's not in use, and that's probably because of these defines a little bit further down that actually indicate which ones are in use. So we're using shader target greater than 30, so it won't be. Okay, we're just going to need to poke around all of these until we figure out which one's actually in use. And then we can strip out the ones we're not using too. Okay, so that's not in use. It's not use either. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to force Unity to use one of these. I'll make it this BRDF1. Looks like the simplest. So we know that this is the function that's actually in use, so I'm just going to swap that around with that one. Okay, so that one we know exists. So BRDF1, which is the simplest. I'll just double check this by I'm probably doing something stupid, and I'm sure everyone is screaming at me what I've done wrong. Check that output is in fact in use. Is in fact in use. In fact, I do have some ideas here that I just want to play with in a second. I think that might just be because we're sharing the same name. It's probably a duplicate redefinition. In fact, that is exactly what it is. Oops. Unity are declaring their own version of this before we are. And as a result, because of the way we've got this, if it's not included, defined, take it out. So in that case, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to cut and paste that back out. And I'm just going to cut and paste the one part we need into the shader. Here we go. So this is the one we're looking for. PBS comic. That's just going to mean we're going to be able to poke at that. The quality in this one won't be as good because we've cut down to the version that's usually used on mobile devices, but because we don't really care about shading complexity here that much, it should be okay. And as we bring up the smoothness and everything else, it does look roughly similar to how I did before. I could even switch to using the more sophisticated versions, but this should be fine. Okay, so I have a couple of other additional thoughts here and just smoothing this out and getting it to behave better. One of them is that I'm thinking that we probably don't ever want the albedo getting higher than, sorry, the output getting higher than the arranged colors. And I think this will give us a lot of power to raise the ambient lighting in the region in order to get those sort of crisp gradients that we were looking for, while still keeping the metallic properties. So what we can do there is, I'm just going to back up this value here. And that's just going to give us the option of doing this. So let's see. That way we should never get brighter than those gradients. This will have some problems with highlights. Shadows will be fine, but highlights will run into some problems. So we'll just need to smooth those over a little bit. All right. Okay. Now this will be most obvious when we start increasing the smoothness again. Shouldn't. There we are. Let's just have a look what happens when we add some brightness to the sunlight. There we go. So this is an insanely bright sun. That is about as big as you can go without it, well, even with it burning out. So this is a brightness of 50. If we bring a normal object in, as you can see, it just goes to pure white. But now we've got this stuff, it's not going to be impacted and get brighter than that. We can still use our smoothness, but we've got a fairly flat lighting model that still gives us some flexibility here on our shadowing and shading. I'm going to change this from soft shadows to hard shadows. No, that's not really working. That's what we want. So we might need to still work on this a little bit, but I think this is probably a good starting point for our shading exercise. Now the next thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to adjust the poster profiles and stacks to sort of bring this out, and also adjust the ambient lighting. One of the things that we are going to be doing here, normally we work with lighting that is more complex than what we'll do here. Here we probably do want ambient colors to just be simple flat gradients because we're injecting all of this ourselves into the environment. The other thing we're going to be doing is playing with the post stack. We're going to want to try and accentuate some of the sort of the contrast and the curve to sort of match the resulting images, and we'll tone map it all back in. So again, if we just go back to our reference image, and it has been a while since we looked at that, this is the desired output, and we will get a lot of that output through a combination of one, flat lighting, And this is probably even flatter than we've produced here. And we'll do that by moderating our use of smoothness and metallics and things, just down to areas that we're going to want to keep them. And so we'll probably keep the smoothness fairly low regardless, but we might use metallics in places here and there. So we might go to about that level on things that are going to be metallic. So we've still got some influence there, but the result is that if we want to sort of have shadows always be blue, we can now get these effects into our scene. There we go. So that's the basics of our lighting model down. And the next lesson will be on actually how to build a scene out of these environments. That is probably going to run up on today's time, but next week we'll actually start building out the environment, and then we'll get into the final chapter, which will be on actually doing the post-processing and getting it. Next week, the topics I'm going to cover particularly are going to be converting textures. So I'm actually going to take some asset packs off the asset store as the basis of building this, and I'm going to show you how to convert them into the line art map files we covered last week. There is actually a bunch of tricks that we worked out for building these, particularly using things like solarization filters in Photoshop, and then masks, and finally producing the sign distance fields from those resulting curves. And that did produce some fairly convincing looks. So I'm going to go, in the meantime, just hunt on the asset store to find some stuff that would fit the right aesthetic. And then we're going to convert that asset pack, and we're also going to use ProBuilder to sort of build up the differences and mix and match. And then we might, after we do the post stack and get the coloring and stylization in place, we might look at doing things like cartoon water or similar things like that before we move on to the next project. But hopefully we've covered some ground here, and you might have learned a little bit on how the lighting of Unity actually works. And if you want to get deep and dirty into creating your own custom lighting models, you've got a lot of power available to you. This is probably on the more sophisticated end of Unity. I think that when you're working with lighting models in Unity and building your own lighting models, you're sort of sitting at the top 0.01% of Unity developers, because a lot of the time you just don't want to mess with this stuff. But the good news is that if you do, the tools are there and we can actually work with them. All right, thank you all for your time, and I'll see you all next week.